Hello, everyone. Welcome back to St. Louis Teens, and welcome back to our new series on young venture capitalists. We are here today with Kevin Zhang, a partner at Bain Capital Ventures and the former head of product at Fundera and a Forbes 30 under 30 venture capitalist. Kevin, thank you for your phenomenal support of the next generation of entrepreneurs, and thank you so much for being here with us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Kevin, can you share with us what drove you to the field of venture capital and what was the most favorite part of your journey so far?
I think that my original thinking in getting into the venture world, I had spent, several years as an early employee and I ran product at, as you mentioned, this company Fundera in New York. And I really enjoyed the experience. I guess I've always thought about myself as more of a builder and founder. And I wasn't sure I wanted to give that up, but I did feel that I have been so focused on one topic for a very long time. At Fundera, my focus was, around helping build our marketplace for small business lending. And it was just, I wasn't convinced that I want to spend the rest of my life, in the small business lending world. And my view of venture capital was it was an opportunity to go and see, get a broader but probably shallower view of more topic areas and that I was interested in business software, in financial technology outside of lending. That was probably the main early driver of my thinking around getting into this world. I think that the part of the journey I've been most I felt most fulfilled by is, it's really I think for me, there's a lot of excitement and gratitude that comes from, the opportunity to be a small part of the success of others. Particularly in the venture world, we get to work with such incredibly talented, smart, brilliant, ambitious people. And when we get to make some small contribution, helping them connect with a customer, or partner, or team member, some expert with knowledge that they need, or otherwise, um, make some contribution to their journey. I think that is probably been always the moments that I think about the most and feel most excited about.
And Kevin, you're now one of the youngest VCs. What are some of your keys to success in the field of venture capital? And what are some of the obstacles that young VCs can often face?
Um, I think that there's really no one right answer. Obviously, to being successful in venture, I feel that over the past 5 years that I've been in this role, and meeting other venture investors along the way, it's I think there's a beautiful thing in the industry, which is that everyone has their own strengths, and there's lots of ways you can be successful. I'd say that the let me talk about the challenges first. I'll come back to the prior questions. I think being a young investor, I think you sort of have a few things, and one is sort of naturally, unless you're someone who is very comfortable building relationships with people who are far older than you are, you generally speaking have a less mature set of relationships. It's just because a lot of people that a lot of your peer set is also young. They're probably more junior level, or as you get a little bit older, maybe mid level. Perhaps like there are a few who are truly exceptional who are at the executive level, but your network isn't full of people who are C-level executives and CEOs and board members, etc. So I do think sort of one element is you have to compete on sort of a different axis. I think the other element that's harder is just that I think people naturally associate age with authority. I think that's a very fair point of view. I think you always get questions around, is this young partner here to stay? Do they have the same knowledge and resources someone older does? Do they have the same authority within the firm if something goes wrong to push for what the company might need if if they need a bridge or something, the company's not doing well, maybe you're better off with someone who's got more white hair and perhaps more authority and influence with their partnership. So I think that those are sort of natural obstacles, and I think if you sort of flip those, I think that they could be opportunities too. I think that being a young investor, you're more often interacting with peers, and you come off, I think, more as someone who understands them, understands what they're trying to do, understands what's happening right now, at the edge of kind of what young people are starting to do, and you come off less as sort of um their parent. I think you come off as sort of, I think it's sort of easier to connect at a social level and an emotional level. And I think that you want to substitute, maybe even if you don't know that many senior people, you can substitute that with a great network of mid-level people. A lot of, what early, the truth is, like, a lot of the work in the industry gets done by, junior and mid-level people who actually understand the day-to-day and actually interact with customers every day. And so I think you can use that differentiation to your advantage as well. Most of the early hires any founder is going to make, they're going to be young people as well. They're not bringing in the CEO of Netflix, as their first or second hire. So I think you can use some of these sort of disadvantages, being a young VC, actually as advantages if you flip them around.
And I think one of the great points that you had brought up there is there's no single answer or key to success in the field of venture capital. So, Kevin, I do want to ask, what are your personal ways that you find new ventures, ideas, and companies? And what are the metrics that you personally use to evaluate them?
I think that for me, a lot of it is getting to meet really talented people. I focus on investing, at the seed and Series A stage, and these days, it doesn't take much more than an idea and some initial proof to raise a seed round. So for me, I think the addressable universe is really who are talented people who have a demonstrated track record of delivering interesting products, growing businesses, and who also are in a position where they might have unique insight into a interesting market or problem. And so I spend sort of a lot of my time just getting to meet and trying to get introduced to talented young people across a range of companies who are clearly rising stars at whatever they're doing, and particularly in spaces that seem to be growing quickly, like financial technology or developer tools or crypto, et cetera. Um, and just sort of trying to build a genuine relationship. Frankly, it's something I would do even if I wasn't in the venture role. In college, I ran the Entrepreneurship Society at Columbia. So just the idea of meeting with, aspiring potential, talent people who want to be founders, and sort of having a real conversation with them, learning about what their questions are, and seeing their ways that I can support them. That's also something I would probably do whether or not I was in this role. And it turns out that actually it's a pretty good way to get to know people early, before they decide to either that it's something they actually want to go do and raise money for.
And Kevin, I do want to ask on that same topic, what is one company that you invested in that you feel is one of the most successful? And at the same time, what is one company that in hindsight you wish you had invested in?
Well, I think that it's hard to choose. Obviously, I work with a lot of companies that I'm really are really exciting and interesting, and I don't want to sort of say that any one of them is particularly more successful than another, but there are ones where I work with them for longer, so they've had longer time to develop and grow. One of those businesses is Grid, which is they provide machine learning infrastructure. And I think it's a good example of the earlier question. I'm still very involved with the entrepreneurship community at Columbia, and I met Will, the founder of Grid, in part because whenever I go to New York, I try and meet a few Columbia people in the technology world. And when I met him, he was still a PhD researcher at Facebook, and he had I think he had discovered a number of pain points in the development of sort of deep learning models, research of them, and deployment of them. And he had built this open source project that made life simpler for him and potentially for lots of other researchers that he knew. And it had gotten very popular very quickly. And that was the stage where we sort of led a seed investment in the company that's since developed into a commercial product that they're selling to to enterprises, on top of some of the community they've built with PyTorch Lightning, the open source library that Will had originally started. So they've gone on to build a pretty impressive team in New York, and raised a couple more rounds of venture capital, but it's all very early. I think these stories play out over 5 to 10 years, but I'm certainly, it's an illustrated example of just, a talented person who really was deep on a particular topic, and that led to our investment behind what they were doing very early in the company. I think that in hindsight, another person I'd known from school actually is the co-founder of a company called Modern Treasury, which is in the broadly speaking, the payments space. It's funny because I had known the co-founder for it was back to our college days, and he was always an impressive person when it came to building interesting products we wanted to use. He had developed this printing software that let you print to any printer on the Columbia network anywhere on campus, even if you weren't close to it. And it was extraordinarily popular in the years that I was in school. And so, I should have known that would lead him to find, another problem that was interesting. After spending, a few years, he was early at a company called Lending Home, which is a leading technology-enabled home lender. But in retrospect, I simply missed it. In fact, I thought that someone else on the team had already met them. And that's frankly the only reason why we didn't pay closer attention. But they've done extraordinarily well so far, and I feel that the more I learn about what they're trying to do and the customer trying to go after, the more I feel that they have pretty incredible product market fit, and they're just like an impressive and kind set of folks, and ones that we should be in business with.
I think that both the stories you shared there are really inspirational, especially because, it's people who are actually very young who are going out and starting these ventures. So, Kevin, I do want to ask, can you share with us the stories of inspiring young entrepreneurs and startups that you've worked with?
Well, I'm sure by far the youngest median founder age among founders that I work with relative to my partners. I wouldn't be surprised if the median age was sort of 26, 27, with sort of founders on both sides of that. I work I work with the founder, Sarah, from this company Alloy Automation. We first got to meet, when she launched a prototype for the product on Product Hunts. She was 18 years old at the time.
Wow.
And one of the reasons why we got inspired to invest actually was that we got to see her growth trajectory over the following, year and a half, as she sort of took that initial prototype and narrowed in on a particular use case in the e-commerce world. And now they're sort of building the leading integration platform for e-commerce. And they've done a really great job of that. But I think she's not much older than she was then. And so I think it is inspiring. I think she's and her co-founder as well are both people who are very thoughtful, product-centric builders. I think they sort of hack their way to this problem, and now they've quickly become, people who others turn to for, e-commerce advice. And so that's been, I think they're just their growth trajectory and their product-centric approach to solving this problem are always things that impress me.
And Kevin, I'm personally very fortunate that my school has an entrepreneurship program called Spark Incubator, and I owe lots of my personal growth to Spark. How do you think more high schools and colleges can facilitate an environment for innovation and entrepreneurship?
Yeah, well, I think it's probably two things. One is two things that I think come to mind for me. Having run the entrepreneurship society at Columbia, perhaps our version of Spark, called Alma Works, actually came out of Core, the student group that I was involved with, and I think that I think that one element that's critical is that we have to recognize that when you think about many of the traditional alternatives that sort of a non-medical, non-law sort of person's thinking about, so a person who might aspire to go into a business-related role, we have to recognize that that any young company, any startup, any technology company, is competing against sort of multi-million or perhaps in aggregate multi-hundreds of millions of dollars of campus recruiting budget spent by traditional consulting firms, banks, FANG, and, in the technology world. And so I think it takes a lot of student energy and a lot of sort of, I think the only way to compete with that budget, I think, is for the university and for students to foster an environment where people can learn about the alternative, can learn about companies that don't have the budget and the time and the resources to come and recruit on campus. I think that's what's so essential about student entrepreneurship programs, is that they create space for people to consider that third or fourth alternative to these sort of traditional sort of quote unquote safe options. I think the second thing that I wish schools would do more is I think that schools for the right reasons. I think people go to liberal arts universities, and I think we are taught we're sort of taught to be socially conscious, as we should be, to be good humans. But I think we're not necessarily taught to be commercially opportunistic. That is to say, we're not taught to run a business. We're not taught to look for, so when I meet students, often they'll say, I want to work on something that solves climate change. I want to work on something that reduces inequality. And I think that those are worthy long-term goals, but I also think there is a parallel and equally important question of, I want to work on a sustainable opportunity that has business that has a big sort of market. And I haven't quite figured out, like, how do you teach this? I think that some of the student agencies, like at Harvard, you can run the local laundromat, et cetera. My guess is those are good training grounds for this. When you just run a company, you sort of see the money going in, coming in, the costs going out. My guess is that there is an instinct, I guess, trained there. But I think that's sort of a missing piece here. Not because I think that, like, commercial greed or whatever is more important than activism, but rather because I think that the marriage of the two is the most likely to create large scale impact.
And Kevin, continuing on that topic, how do you think that teen entrepreneurs can leverage the resources of the venture capital world?
Well, venture capital is not off limits to teenagers. There are certainly teenage founders who have raised venture capital. I think that, to me, venture capital from just another node in a fabric, of relationships that permeate, the technology world here in the U.S. and by extension around the world, right? Like, I think I think the real question is, like, what are the things teen entrepreneurs can focus on, might generally focus on improving, and who are people who can help them with that, and how might they ask, right? So I think one thing a lot of teen entrepreneurs lack by definition is industry experience. By definition, if you're younger, you just had fewer years to go and work in, I don't know, the timber industry. And so I think that I think it is important. I don't think you need to be in fact, in some ways you don't want to be like a 10-15 year veteran of the, say, timber industry to build a company in it. But I do think that people benefit from talking to people in that industry, from talking to potential customers. And I think what venture investors can offer generally is sort of more of a market overview, a high level view of, here's what we, people who have some involvement in, here's what we're seeing in that market. Here's what we think are some trends that may be interesting or may affect how you think about the opportunity. Here are some companies we think that are interesting, worth taking a look at as comparison points. To me, you can think about venture investors perhaps offering like a compass, or a bit of an atlas, not a very detailed atlas, right? Like not enough to like sort of like pinpoint the treasure, but enough to know like there are hills here and mountains there and lake over there, and sort of enough to sort of look at points of interest and help people zoom in on potential areas to dig in.
And finally, Kevin, what is your advice for teens and youth, and how can we be innovators and be agents of change just like yourself?
Um, I think the thing that I wish I knew was not exactly the question you asked. I think the thing I wish I knew, sort of teenager or young person, is that uh I guess sort of when I was that age, I felt like there were people like me, and then there were people like the people you see on TV, right? Like the sort of people simplistically, or I guess if you're young now, on YouTube or whatever, which is like there's sort of like me, like sort of like mortal people, right? And then there's sort of this sort of different class of founders and CEOs and VCs and whatever, who and sort of I also like those people do those things. Like I live in their world, and hopefully not most of the audience that you speak to feels this way, but I felt that way, and I think like the point I would just make is that um, uh, that pane of glass you feel, it doesn't exist, doesn't need to exist, and that so you can do whatever you want. The sort of person you see in the TV who's sort of the CEO of some company they founded when they were relatively young. It's not like other people who always are that person. Like you can be that person, but you just have to get started. And I think I think I didn't appreciate sort of necessarily. I feel like I put invisible boundaries on what I thought I could go do, and I'm not sure that. I think maybe I would have learned more had I sort of opened myself more to sort of the more ambitious possibilities.
Kevin, we thank you so much for your phenomenal leadership, support of the venture community, and for your support of young entrepreneurs and the value that they bring to our country. And thank you so much for being here with us today and answering all of our questions.
Of course, glad to be here. Hopefully, some of this is helpful.